The alarm clock's shrill beeping cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:15 in the morning, just as it had every weekday for the past 9 years. Carmen Torres reached out from beneath the thin comforter and silenced it with a practiced motion, her fingers finding the button without fully waking. She lay still for a moment in the quiet apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the tiny kitchen and the distant sound of traffic beginning to build on the highway 3 blocks away. Through the bedroom's single window, the sky held that peculiar quality of early morning darkness that feels different from the darkness of true night, a shade lighter, promising dawn, but not yet delivering it. Carmen rose and moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of long habit. The bathroom mirror showed a woman of 37 with tired eyes and worry lines beginning to etch themselves around her mouth. She splashed cold water on her face, brushed her teeth with a toothbrush that needed replacing, and pulled her dark hair back into a tight bun that would stay neat through 12 hours of work. The apartment was small, a 1-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed in the 1970s and showed every year of its age. The carpet was worn through to the backing in the high traffic areas. The kitchen linoleum had cracks that no amount of cleaning could make look better. The bathroom faucet dripped constantly, a steady ping-ping-ping into the stained porcelain sink that the landlord kept promising to fix. But it was home, and Carmen paid the rent on time every month through work that left her back aching and her hands raw. She worked as a housekeeper for Marcus Blackwood, a man whose net worth was calculated in billions, whose mansions sprawled across 15 acres of prime real estate in the wealthiest suburb of the city. For 9 years she had cleaned his floors, dusted his furniture, scrubbed his bathrooms, and remained as invisible as the air he breathed. This morning, like every morning this week, she had to wake her son. School was on spring break, and the after-school program Diego usually attended was closed for renovations. Carmen had called every babysitter she could afford, reached out to the few acquaintances she had in the city, even asked her supervisor if there was any way Diego could stay in a staff area at the mansion. The answer had been clear. If she couldn't find childcare, she should take the week off without pay. Carmen couldn't afford to lose a week's wages. Rent was due in 8 days, and her checking account balance made her stomach hurt every time she looked at it. So Diego came to work with her, and she prayed every morning that Marcus Blackwood wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, wouldn't make this into a problem that could cost her the job she desperately needed. She entered the bedroom she shared with her son and gently shook his shoulder. Diego was small for his age, all long limbs and serious eyes, his face still holding the softness of childhood. He had turned 10 3 months ago, and Carmen had managed to save enough to buy him the one thing he'd asked for, a book about space exploration that cost $23 at the bookstore. She'd seen his face light up in a way that made every extra shift, every skipped lunch, every sacrifice worth it. Diego stirred and opened his eyes, immediately alert in the way some children are, without the gradual confusion of waking. He looked at his mother and nodded, understanding without being told that it was time to get ready. He dressed in the semi-darkness, pulling on jeans that were getting too short, and a t-shirt with a cartoon astronaut on the front, bright colors that seemed too cheerful for the pre-dawn gloom. He packed his backpack with the homework his teacher had assigned over break, 2 library books, and a worn notebook where he liked to work through math problems. By 5:30, they were in Carmen's 15-year-old sedan, pulling out of the apartment complex parking lot as the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue. The drive took 40 minutes, taking them from the cramped neighborhoods where Carmen could afford to live, through middle-class subdivisions with modest houses and neat lawns, past gated communities with brick walls and security checkpoints, and finally into the realm of true wealth, where estates measured their acreage in double digits and mansions looked like something from a European fairy tale. The Blackwood estate announced itself long before they reached it, the road narrowed and smoothed, the pavement perfect and unmarred by potholes. Trees lined both sides, their branches meeting overhead to form a natural tunnel. Then the iron gates appeared, 15 feet tall and elaborate with decorative scrollwork, flanked by stone pillars that supported security cameras and motion sensors. Carmen pulled around to the service entrance, a less ostentatious gate on the eastern side of the property that led to a paved drive, ending at the kitchen and utility areas of the mansion. She pressed the intercom button, announced herself, and waited for the electronic buzz that meant the gate was unlocking. The sedan rolled through, and Diego pressed his face to the window, watching the grounds open up around them. Even in the early morning dimness, the scale of the property was evident. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched away in every direction, broken by ornamental gardens, stone fountains, and stands of carefully cultivated trees. The driveway curved past a tennis court, a swimming pool with an attached pool house that was larger than Carmen's entire apartment, and a 4-car garage housing vehicles that each cost more than she would earn in 5 years. The mansion itself rose before them, a massive structure of white stone and tall windows that gleamed even in the weak dawn light. It looked like something transported from another era, all columns and balconies and architectural details that spoke of wealth so vast it could be spent on beauty for its own sake. Lights glowed in a few windows on the upper floors, but most of the house was still dark. The staff entrance they approached was plain by comparison, a simple door beside a loading area where deliveries were received. Carmen parked in the small lot reserved for household staff, between a pickup truck that belonged to the groundskeeper and a compact car driven by the cook. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, gathering herself. Beside her, Diego waited patiently, his backpack already on his lap. "Remember what I told you," Carmen said quietly, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. "Stay silent. Don't draw attention. Find a corner and do your homework. If Mr. Blackwood comes near, make yourself invisible. Don't touch anything you're not supposed to touch. Don't ask questions. Just sit quietly until it's time to go home. Can you do that for me?" Diego nodded solemnly. "Yes, Mama. I'll be invisible." They entered through the kitchen entrance, the door unlocking with Carmen's employee keycard. The kitchen was a vast space of stainless steel appliances and granite countertops, everything spotless and organized with the precision of a commercial operation. The cook wouldn't arrive for another hour, but Carmen's duties started earlier. She was responsible for the initial cleaning before the household fully awoke, ensuring that when Marcus Blackwood emerged from his private suite, everything would be perfect. She set Diego up in the small staff break room, a windowless space off the main kitchen with a folding table, 3 mismatched chairs, and a water cooler that gurgled and hummed. Diego took out his homework and bent over it immediately, his pencil moving across the page with careful precision. Carmen watched him for a moment, her heart aching with a complicated mixture of love and guilt and fear. He shouldn't have to spend his school break in a windowless room, silent and invisible, afraid to be noticed, but this was their reality, and reality offered no better options. She began her work, moving through the mansion with the quiet efficiency of long practice. First the main kitchen, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, checking that everything was in its proper place. Then the formal dining room, a cavernous space with a table that could seat 24, and a crystal chandelier that cost more than Carmen would earn in a decade. She dusted the table's polished surface, adjusted the fresh flower arrangement that the florist had delivered yesterday, straightened chairs that didn't need straightening. The morning light was growing stronger now, streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the opulence of the Blackwood mansion in golden detail. Carmen moved through the ground floor rooms methodically, her cart of cleaning supplies rolling silently on the thick carpets, the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves holding thousands of leather-bound books that no one ever read, the music room with a grand piano that no one ever played, the formal living room with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, arranged with mathematical precision on Persian rugs that were worth more than most people's houses. Everything in the mansion was expensive, beautiful, and somehow lifeless. It was a showpiece rather than a home, designed to impress visitors and demonstrate wealth rather than provide comfort or warmth. Carmen had worked here for 9 years and had never seen Marcus Blackwood sit in one of the living room chairs just to relax, never heard music from the music room, never witnessed anyone actually reading one of those thousands of books. The mansion was a monument to money, and like most monuments, it was cold and empty at its core. She finished the ground floor and moved upstairs, pushing her cart carefully up the sweeping staircase with its marble steps and brass railings. The second floor held guest bedrooms that were always pristine because they were rarely used, bathrooms gleaming with fixtures plated in actual gold, and at the far end of the east wing, Marcus Blackwood's private office. This was the heart of his domain, the room where he conducted business, made deals, and controlled his empire. Carmen cleaned it last, always careful, always aware that this room held secrets and documents that were none of her concern. The office door was closed but not locked. She knocked softly, waited 3 seconds, then entered. The room was empty, as expected. Marcus Blackwood rarely appeared before 8 in the morning, and it was only 6:45 now. The office was decorated in dark wood and leather, with a massive desk dominating the center of the room, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining 2 walls, and a sitting area with a leather couch and chairs arranged around a coffee table. One wall was taken up by a window that offered a view of the grounds, the gardens, and in the distance, the city skyline. But what dominated the room, what drew the eye immediately upon entering, was the safe. It stood against the north wall, a monolithic presence of brushed steel that rose nearly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Carmen had watched it being installed 6 months ago, remembered the team of technicians who'd spent 2 days just getting it positioned and bolted to the reinforced floor. She'd overheard enough of the installation process to know that this wasn't an ordinary safe, that it had been custom-built to Marcus Blackwood's specifications, that it had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Carmen dusted around it carefully, never touching its surface directly, aware that her fingerprints on that steel would be noticed and questioned. She'd learned early in her employment that Marcus Blackwood was paranoid about security, that he trusted no one, that he saw potential theft in every interaction. She'd learned to be extra careful, to document her movements, to never give him reason to suspect her of anything improper. She finished cleaning the office and returned downstairs to check on Diego. He was exactly where she'd left him, hunched over his math homework, his pencil moving steadily across the page. He looked up when she entered and gave her a small smile that made her heart squeeze. "You okay, baby?" she asked softly. "I'm okay, Mama. This is kinda interesting." He gestured at his homework. "The teacher gave us these problems about calculating distances between planets. I've been figuring out how long it would take to travel to Mars at different speeds." Carmen smiled despite her exhaustion. Her son had always been bright, had always loved numbers and patterns in a way that sometimes amazed her. His teachers had said he was gifted, that his memory was exceptional, that he could recall details with a precision that was rare. But his underfunded public school had no programs for gifted students, no resources to nurture his talents. The best she could do was check out library books that challenged him and hope that someday, somehow, she'd be able to afford better opportunities for him. That's wonderful, baby. Keep working. I have to go prepare the main floor for when Mr. Blackwood wakes up. The morning progressed in its usual pattern. The cook arrived at 7 and began preparing breakfast. The groundskeeper came in briefly to report on a sprinkler issue. The driver arrived to prepare the vehicles. By 7:45, the mansion was fully awake and functioning, all systems in place to serve its single occupant. Marcus Blackwood emerged from his private suite at 8:12. Carmen heard his footsteps on the stairs, the heavy tread of a large man who'd never learned to move quietly because he'd never needed to. She was in the formal living room at that moment, and she instinctively moved toward the wall, making herself as unobtrusive as possible. Through the doorway, she could see him cross the entrance hall toward the dining room, where his breakfast would be waiting. He was a big man, 6'2" and soft around the middle, with thinning hair he combed carefully to disguise its retreat, and a face that seemed locked in a permanent expression of vague displeasure. He wore expensive suits even at home, as if he could never quite relax, never quite stop performing the role of successful businessman. Carmen waited until he'd disappeared into the dining room before continuing her work. She'd learned that Marcus Blackwood preferred the staff to be present but invisible, to materialize when needed and vanish when not. Speaking directly to him was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Making eye contact was seen as presumptuous. He didn't want to know about her life, her struggles, her humanity. He wanted clean floors and fresh flowers and silence. The morning passed without incident. Carmen worked through her task list, checking off rooms as she completed them. Diego remained in the break room, occasionally venturing out to use the bathroom or refill his water bottle, but mostly staying hidden as instructed. By noon, Carmen was beginning to think they might make it through the day without problems. Then Marcus Blackwood came to the kitchen looking for something, and he saw Diego sitting in the break room, visible through the open door. The billionaire stopped in the kitchen doorway, his eyes fixing on the small figure bent over a book at the folding table. His expression shifted from surprise to displeasure to something harder. He stood there for a long moment, just staring, and Carmen felt her stomach drop. She'd been in the pantry checking inventory, but she heard the silence, that particular quality of stillness that meant something was wrong, and she emerged to find Marcus Blackwood glaring at her son. "What is that?" Marcus Blackwood asked, his voice cold. Carmen hurried forward, her hands twisting together anxiously. "My son, Mr. Blackwood. I apologize. School is closed this week and I had no one to watch him. It won't happen again. You brought a child to my house without asking permission." "I did ask, sir. I spoke to the house manager last week. She said as long as he stayed out of the way, it would be acceptable for this week only." This was partially true. Carmen had mentioned her childcare problem to the house manager, who'd said something vague about it probably being fine for a day or two. But Carmen had stretched that into a week because she had no other choice, and now she stood there hoping Marcus Blackwood wouldn't call her on the embellishment. He looked at Diego again, his lip curling slightly. "Keep him out of my sight. I don't run a daycare. And tell him not to touch anything. You people need to learn boundaries." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like smoke. Carmen had heard variations of it many times over the years, always delivered with that particular inflection that made its meaning clear. She nodded mutely, not trusting her voice, and moved to the break room to pull Diego further out of view. That was the first day. The second day, Marcus Blackwood saw Diego again, this time in a hallway as Diego was carrying his mother's cleaning supplies to save her a trip. The billionaire had been on his phone, striding through the house with the distracted air of someone conducting business while in motion, and he nearly collided with the boy. He stopped, looked down at Diego with obvious irritation, and then said into his phone, loud enough to be clearly heard, "Hold on, I need to navigate around the help's kid." Unbelievable. This is what happens when you're too generous with the staff. Diego had frozen in place, trying to make himself smaller, his hands gripping the handle of his mother's cleaning caddy. Marcus Blackwood stepped around him with exaggerated care, as if Diego might contaminate him through proximity, and continued his phone conversation while walking away. When these people start bringing their families to work, you know standards are slipping, probably planning to scope out valuables. Got to watch them constantly. The third day brought worse. Diego had finished his morning homework and was reading one of his library books, a volume on advanced mathematics that his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had given him specifically. She'd told Carmen that Diego was working at a level 3 grades above his peers, that his ability to understand complex concepts and remember formulas was extraordinary. The book was dense with equations and graphs, challenging material that Diego found fascinating. Marcus Blackwood walked into the break room without knocking, looking for something in the storage cabinet mounted on the wall. He glanced at Diego, then at the book, and laughed. It was a harsh sound, devoid of actual humor. Advanced mathematics. That's precious. He reached past Diego to open the cabinet. Someone should teach these kids to have realistic expectations. You know what happens when people like you try to reach above your station? Disappointment, failure. You'd be better off learning a trade, something practical. God knows we need more janitors. He found what he was looking for, some kind of office supply, and left without another word. Diego stared at the page of his book, but his eyes weren't moving anymore, and Carmen found him 10 minutes later with tears running silently down his face. "Baby," she whispered, pulling him into her arms in the small windowless room where no cameras could see them. "Baby, don't listen to him. He's wrong. You're brilliant. You're going to do amazing things." "But why does he hate us, Mama?" Diego's voice was small and broken. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to read my book." Carmen held him tighter, her own tears threatening. "Some people just have hate in their hearts, mijo. They look at us and they see something to look down on, something to feel superior to. It's not about what you did, it's about what he is. But we need this job, we need the money, so we have to be strong, we have to survive this. Can you be strong for me?" Diego nodded against her shoulder, but she felt his small body shaking. They stayed like that for several minutes, this mother and son seeking comfort in a windowless room in a mansion that cost more than they could fathom, surrounded by wealth that would never be theirs, surviving moment by moment in a world that kept telling them they didn't matter. What Carmen didn't know, couldn't have known, was that her son's extraordinary mind was recording everything. Diego had what his teachers called eidetic memory, though they'd never used that exact term around Carmen because his school lacked the resources for formal testing or programs for gifted students. But Mrs. Patterson had researched it after noticing Diego's abilities, had read about photographic memory and perfect recall, and had gently explained to Carmen that her son's brain worked differently than most people's. Diego remembered everything he saw with perfect clarity. Every page he read became a photograph in his mind that he could examine later in perfect detail. Every conversation he overheard was recorded verbatim, every number and sequence stored permanently and accessible. He couldn't forget things even if he wanted to. His memory worked like a camera that was always on, always capturing, always preserving. And so Diego was recording Marcus Blackwood's behavior with perfect fidelity. Every cruel comment, every inflection, every expression of contempt. His mind stored it all, building a comprehensive catalogue of exactly who Marcus Blackwood was when he thought no one important was watching. The fourth day arrived, with rain drumming against the windows and a grey sky that matched Carmen's mood. She was exhausted, running on too little sleep and too much stress, worried constantly about keeping Diego safe and invisible while meeting her work obligations. They arrived at the mansion before dawn as usual, and Carmen set Diego up in the break room with instructions that were becoming unnecessary because he knew them by heart now. Stay hidden, stay quiet, don't give anyone a reason to notice you. The morning progressed through its familiar rhythms. Carmen moved through her cleaning routine while Diego worked through homework that he'd already completed twice because he'd finished the week's assignments on the first day. He was now creating his own math problems, using principles from the advanced book to devise increasingly complex equations. His mind needed stimulation the way other people needed food, and the windowless break room, with its folding table and fluorescent lighting, was slowly becoming a cage. At 10:30, Carmen was cleaning the second-floor hallway when she heard Marcus Blackwood's voice rising from his office. He was on a phone call, and he sounded angry. The words drifted through his partially open office door, snippets of a conversation that was clearly not going well. I don't care what the projections say, make the numbers work, move it offshore if you have to, use the Cayman accounts. That's why we set them up. No paper trail, no problems, and if anyone asks questions, you tell them it's a standard practice. Completely legal, we've got lawyers for this. Carmen quickly moved past, not wanting to be caught lingering near his office. She'd learned early in her employment that being nearby when Marcus Blackwood was conducting business could lead to accusations of eavesdropping, even if you were simply doing your job. But she'd heard enough to understand that whatever he was discussing sounded questionable at best, illegal at worst. Not that it was any of her concern. People like Carmen didn't question people like Marcus Blackwood. They just cleaned up after them and tried to stay invisible. The day dragged on. Lunch was a brief 15 minutes in the break room with Diego, sharing sandwiches Carmen had packed that morning. Diego was subdued, his usual brightness dimmed by days of confinement and humiliation. He picked at his sandwich without much appetite, while Carmen tried to think of something encouraging to say, some way to make this bearable. "Only 2 more days," she finally offered. "Then school starts again and you can go back to Mrs. Patterson's class, see your friends, get back to normal." Diego nodded but said nothing. Normal, Carmen thought bitterly, was relative. Normal for them meant navigating a world that saw them as less than, as obstacles, as threats. Normal meant working 3 times as hard for half the respect. Normal meant teaching your 10-year-old son to make himself invisible so that wealthy white men wouldn't feel inconvenienced by his existence. The afternoon brought a new challenge. Marcus Blackwood decided he wanted his office deep cleaned, which meant Carmen needed to spend extended time in there with him present. He sat at his desk working on his computer while she dusted and vacuumed and cleaned windows, making herself as quiet and unobtrusive as possible. The massive safe dominated her peripheral vision as she worked, and she was acutely aware of never touching it, never even looking at it directly. Marcus Blackwood's paranoia about that safe was well known among the staff. The driver had been fired 6 months ago for making a joke about what might be inside it. The previous housekeeper had been let go for dusting its surface without being specifically instructed to do so. Carmen finished the deep clean and left the office, her back aching from the physical labor and her mind aching from the constant vigilance required to avoid giving offense. She returned to the break room to check on Diego and found him working through a book on physics that he'd borrowed from the library, his young face serious with concentration as he read about gravitational forces and orbital mechanics. That evening they left the mansion as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that did nothing to warm the cold weight in Carmen's chest. The drive home took them back through the layers of society, from the realm of extreme wealth to the neighborhoods where she could afford to exist. Diego fell asleep in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window, and Carmen glanced at him frequently as she drove. He looked so small, so vulnerable, and she felt the familiar surge of fierce love mixed with helpless rage that she couldn't protect him better, couldn't give him a life where he didn't have to learn to be invisible. They arrived at their apartment complex as full darkness settled over the city. The building looked shabbier than usual, the exterior lighting inadequate, the parking lot cracked and potholed. Carmen parked and gently woke Diego, and they climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, both of them too tired to talk. Inside, Carmen made them a simple dinner of rice and beans, while Diego sat at their small kitchen table and returned to his homework. The apartment felt even smaller after spending the day in Marcus Blackwood's mansion. The contrast brutal and unavoidable, but it was theirs, paid for by Carmen's hard work, and it was home in a way that mansion with its 15 acres and endless rooms would never be. After dinner, Diego took his shower in the bathroom with the dripping faucet while Carmen washed their few dishes by hand. The routine was familiar and somehow comforting despite its reminders of everything they lacked. When Diego emerged in his pajamas, his hair still damp, Carmen tucked him into the bed they shared and sat beside him for a moment. "I'm proud of you, mijo," she said softly. "I know this week has been hard. I know Mr. Blackwood has been cruel, but you've been so strong, so good. Just 2 more days and it'll be over." Diego looked up at her with those serious eyes that seemed too old for his face. "I don't understand why some people are mean for no reason, Mama. What did we ever do to him? Nothing, baby. We did nothing. Some people are just broken inside. They need to put others down to feel big. That's not about you. That's about something wrong in them." Diego nodded slowly, processing this. "Mama, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If someone like Mr. Blackwood needed help, like if there was something only I could do to help him, should I do it? Even though he's been so mean?" Carmen considered the question carefully. This was one of those moments that mattered, where her answer would shape how her son saw the world and his place in it. She chose her words slowly. "I think," she said finally, "that being a good person means helping others even when they don't deserve it, but it also means protecting yourself. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Do you understand?" "I think so." Diego's eyes were already getting heavy. "It means I should help if I can, but not if it hurts me too much." "Something like that? Yes. Now sleep, baby. Tomorrow will come soon enough." She kissed his forehead and turned off the light, leaving only the small lamp in the main room burning. She had paperwork to review, bills to organize, but she was too exhausted to think clearly. Instead, she sat on their threadbare couch and stared at the wall, wondering how many more years she'd have to work in that mansion, how many more years Diego would have to witness her degradation, how they were ever going to break out of this cycle. The next day was Friday, the 5th day of this difficult week. They woke at 4:15 as always, dressed in the darkness, drove through the dawn to the mansion. Carmen set Diego up in the break room, began her cleaning routine, and tried not to think about how this pattern was grinding her down day by day, year by year, until she sometimes felt like there was nothing left of who she used to be. Marcus Blackwood had a business luncheon that afternoon, some gathering of executives and investors at an expensive restaurant downtown. He left the mansion at 11:30 in his black luxury sedan, driven by the new driver who'd replaced the one fired for the joke about the safe. The house felt different with him gone, the air itself seeming lighter, as if his presence carried a weight that dispersed in his absence. Carmen took advantage of his absence to deep clean his office, a task that was always easier when he wasn't there watching her with suspicious eyes. She dusted every surface, vacuumed thoroughly, cleaned the windows until they gleamed. Diego sat in the leather chair behind Marcus Blackwood's desk while she worked, something he'd never have dared to do if the billionaire were present, and Carmen couldn't help but smile at the sight. Her son looked so small in that enormous chair, his feet not reaching the floor, but he sat up straight and pretended to type on an invisible keyboard, with an expression of exaggerated importance that made Carmen laugh. "Mr. Blackwood, I need those reports immediately," Diego said in a pompous voice, "and tell those people to work harder. I don't pay them to sit around." Carmen laughed again, but it was tinged with bitterness. Even her 10-year-old son had learned exactly who Marcus Blackwood was, had absorbed enough to parody his cruelty. She finished cleaning, and they left the office, Diego returning to his homework in the break room, while Carmen continued her rounds. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Marcus Blackwood called at 3 to say he'd be late returning, that he was going directly from lunch to another meeting downtown. Carmen finished her work early and spent the extra time in the break room with Diego, helping him with a particularly complex math problem that had him stumped. She marveled at how his mind worked, how he could see patterns and relationships that were invisible to her, how he could recall every formula and theorem with perfect accuracy. "Mrs. Patterson says I might be able to skip a grade next year," Diego said as he worked through the problem. "Maybe even 2 grades in math. She says if I take some tests, they might let me take advanced classes at the middle school, even though I'm only going into 5th grade. Carmen felt her chest tighten. Advanced programs meant fees for materials, transportation to a different school, time commitments that might conflict with her work schedule. But she smiled and touched his cheek gently. "That's wonderful, mijo. We'll figure it out. You're so smart. You deserve every opportunity." They left the mansion at 6, earlier than usual, driving home through Friday evening traffic that made the 40-minute drive stretch to nearly an hour. At home, Carmen made them a more elaborate dinner than usual, splurging on chicken that she'd been able to buy on sale earlier in the week. They ate together at their small table, and for a little while it was possible to forget the mansion and Marcus Blackwood and the constant weight of survival. The weekend passed in a welcome blur of normalcy. Carmen caught up on laundry and cleaning their apartment. Diego played with neighborhood kids in the complex's small playground, his laughter drifting through the open windows and making Carmen smile. They went to the library on Saturday afternoon, Diego emerging with a stack of books that would keep him busy for weeks. On Sunday they attended church, the small congregation of mostly working-class Latino families that had been Carmen's community for the past 5 years. It was a place where she could breathe, where Diego could be himself, where they weren't invisible or less than. But Monday came with the inevitable weight of returning to work, and with it came the 6th and final day of having Diego at the mansion. They went through their morning routine in silence, both of them tired and neither looking forward to the day ahead. The drive to the mansion felt longer than usual, the contrast between their life and Marcus Blackwood's wealth seeming sharper in the morning light. They entered through the service entrance, and Carmen settled Diego in the break room for what she hoped would be the last time. "One more day, baby," she said, kissing the top of his head. "Just one more day, and then you're back to school and everything goes back to normal." "Normal," Diego repeated, and the word sounded hollow. Carmen began her work, moving through the familiar pattern of cleaning and straightening and ensuring everything was perfect for when Marcus Blackwood woke. But something felt different this morning, a tension in the air that she couldn't quite identify. The cook arrived and immediately began complaining about a problem with one of the ovens. The groundskeeper reported that someone had driven over one of the garden beds during the night, leaving deep tire tracks through carefully cultivated flowers. Everything felt slightly off, the smooth operation of the household disrupted by small malfunctions. Marcus Blackwood appeared at 8:40, later than usual and looking disheveled. His hair wasn't carefully combed, his shirt was wrinkled, and he moved with the careful precision of someone nursing a hangover. Carmen made herself invisible as he passed through the entrance hall, but not before she caught the smell of alcohol still on him. He'd been out late, drinking heavily, and had come home in a condition that wasn't unusual, but was always unpleasant. The morning progressed tensely. Marcus Blackwood was irritable and short-tempered, snapping at the cook over breakfast, yelling at his assistant over the phone about some missing documents. Carmen stayed out of his way as much as possible, but around 10:30 she had to clean the second-floor hallway, and she could hear him in his office, his voice raised in anger. "I don't care where they are. I need those files now. Check the safe." "No, wait, I'll check it myself. Just hold on." There was a long pause, then a muttered curse, then another pause, longer this time. Then Marcus Blackwood's voice again, but different now, with an edge of panic. "Call me back." Carmen hurried past his office, not wanting to be nearby when he was in this mood. She finished the upstairs hallway and returned downstairs, where she found Diego in the break room, hunched over one of his library books. He looked up when she entered, his young face showing the strain of 6 days of being invisible, of being quiet, of absorbing cruelty from a man who saw him as less than human. "Not much longer, mijo," she said softly. "Few more hours, and we can go home." But the day wasn't done with them yet. It was only Monday morning, and the crisis that would change everything was just beginning to unfold, 3 rooms away, behind the closed door of Marcus Blackwood's office, where a man was discovering that his fortress of steel had become his prison. Marcus Blackwood stood before his safe at 10:47 in the morning, staring at it with growing disbelief that was rapidly transforming into full-blown panic. He'd spun the dial 4 times now, trying the combination that he'd created 6 months ago, the sequence that he'd been certain he would never forget. Left 3 times to 49, he thought. Or was it 47? Right twice to 25. Or 23? Left once to 93. Or was it 91, right to 17, or 15? Every attempt ended the same way, with the safe remaining locked, mocking him with its impenetrable silence. The mechanism made no sound, gave no indication whether he was close or completely wrong. It simply stayed locked, keeping his most valuable possessions sealed away, inaccessible. Marcus tried the combination again, moving more slowly this time, trying to recall exactly what numbers he'd chosen and why. The numbers meant something. He remembered that much. They were significant dates, important figures, carefully selected to be memorable. But in his current state, hungover and panicked and unable to think clearly, the significance escaped him. Was 47 the year his father died? Or was that 48? Was his lucky number 23 or 25? The details blurred together, and the more he tried to focus, the more elusive they became. He'd been out until 3 in the morning at a charity gala, one of those lavish events where the city's wealthy gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity while drinking champagne that cost $500 a bottle. Marcus had been the guest of honor, receiving an award for philanthropic leadership that was really just recognition for the tax-deductible donations he'd made to various causes. He'd given a speech about giving back to the community, about responsibility and compassion, words that meant nothing but sounded good and earned him applause. The celebration had continued at an exclusive club afterward, more drinks, more backslapping, more performance of the role he'd perfected over decades. Marcus Blackwood, billionaire philanthropist, community leader, self-made success story. He'd stumbled home sometime after 3, drunk enough that the driver had needed to help him to the door, and he'd collapsed into bed without bothering to undress. Now it was morning, and his assistant had called with an urgent problem. The Henderson merger, a $400 million deal that Marcus had been negotiating for 8 months, was in trouble. The other party was demanding documentation that had been promised weeks ago, financial records and offshore account information that proved Marcus's company had the assets to support the acquisition. That documentation was in the safe, along with bearer bonds worth millions and corporate files that couldn't be reproduced. The Henderson people were threatening to walk away if the documents weren't produced by end of business today. 8 months of negotiations, millions in potential profit, all hanging in the balance because Marcus couldn't remember a goddamn combination that he'd created himself. He tried again, and again, and again. Each attempt ending in failure, each failed attempt ratcheting up his panic another notch. By 11:30, Marcus was sweating despite the office's climate control, his hands trembling as he spun the dial. The numbers wouldn't come, wouldn't resolve themselves into the correct sequence, and with each failed attempt, he felt his carefully constructed empire beginning to shake. At noon, Marcus called the safe manufacturers in Switzerland. He was transferred 3 times before reaching someone who could access his account records, and the conversation that followed made his stomach drop. "Mr. Blackwood," the technician said in accented English, "your custom unit was built according to very specific requirements. You signed documentation waiving all manufacturer support for lock recovery. We have no backup combination, no override system, no emergency access protocol. This was done at your explicit insistence." Marcus remembered now, remembered dictating those exact requirements. No back doors, no manufacturer access, no possible way for anyone to open his safe except with the combination he alone knew. It had seemed like genius at the time, the ultimate security. Now, it was a trap. "But what if I forget the combination?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. "Then the safe remains locked until it can be professionally cracked, which, given its construction, could take many months." Again, sir, this was clearly explained during the design consultation. The call ended, and Marcus stood staring at his safe with a mixture of rage and disbelief. His perfect fortress had become his perfect prison, and he was completely helpless. He called his assistant back. "Get me safe specialists, the best. I don't care what it costs. Get them here now." The first team arrived at 2 in the afternoon, 3 men with equipment cases and professional confidence that evaporated as soon as they examined the safe. The lead specialist, a graying man named Ronald, who supposedly had 30 years of experience, spent 90 minutes running acoustic tests and electromagnetic scans before delivering his assessment. "Mr. Blackwood, this is extraordinary craftsmanship. Resistance Class 7, purely mechanical lock, no electronic components to bypass. Without the combination or the original blueprints, we're looking at 6 months minimum to crack this, maybe longer." "I don't have 6 months," Marcus snapped. "I need it open today." "That's not possible, sir. Not with this particular unit. Your best option is to try to remember the combination." The specialists worked until 7 in the evening, trying every technique they knew. None of it helped. Marcus watched them fail for hours, his panic mounting with every useless attempt, until finally he dismissed them and poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands. His phone was full of increasingly urgent messages from his assistant, his lawyers, the Henderson team. Everyone needed something from that safe, and the safe wasn't giving up its contents. Tuesday brought a second team of specialists, younger and more aggressive in their methods. They brought computers running probability algorithms, sensitive microphones that could supposedly detect the tumblers aligning, pressure sensors that measured microscopic movements in the dial. They worked for 10 hours, and the safe remained locked. Wednesday, a third team. Thursday, a fourth. Each group of experts arrived confident and left defeated. The safe was simply too well designed, too secure, too perfect in its construction. Marcus Blackwood had succeeded brilliantly in creating an impenetrable fortress, and now he was trapped outside it. By Friday morning, 6 days after discovering he couldn't open his safe, Marcus Blackwood was coming apart. The Henderson deal had collapsed completely, costing him not just $400 million, but his reputation in the business community. Word had spread that something was wrong with his operation, that he couldn't deliver on commitments, that his company was unstable, partners were getting nervous, investors were asking questions, his board of directors had called an emergency meeting for Monday to discuss his fitness to lead, and still the safe remained locked. The fifth team of specialists arrived Friday afternoon, led by a woman named Elena Voss, who had a reputation for cracking the impossible. She was in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, and she'd come with 2 assistants and enough equipment to fill Marcus's office. They began their examination while Marcus sat at his desk, drinking whiskey at 2 in the afternoon and watching his empire crumble in real time through the notifications on his phone. Carmen was cleaning in the adjacent sitting room, trying to stay invisible while also trying to keep track of Diego's whereabouts. Her son had been in the break room for most of the day, but curiosity about all the activity in the mansion had drawn him out. She'd found him twice already standing in hallways, watching the specialists come and go with their equipment, his young face fascinated by all the technical apparatus. "Stay out of the way," she'd whispered urgently each time. "Don't let Mr. Blackwood see you. Just stay in the break room and read your books." But Diego's curiosity was powerful, and the mansion was full of interesting things happening. By mid-afternoon, Carmen was having trouble keeping him confined, and her anxiety about it was making it hard to concentrate on her work. At 2:47, everything changed. Marcus Blackwood stood up from his desk suddenly, his movements unsteady from the whiskey he'd been consuming. He looked around his office at the specialists and their equipment, at the safe that had defeated 5 teams over 6 days, at the wreckage of his professional life scattered across his desk in the form of legal notices and angry emails. And something inside him snapped. $200 million, he shouted, his voice thick with alcohol and desperation. $200 million to anyone who can open this goddamn safe. The room went silent. Elena Voss's hands stopped moving on her equipment. Her assistants looked up from their computers. Everyone turned to stare at Marcus, who was swaying slightly on his feet, his face flushed, his eyes wild. "Mr. Blackwood," Elena said carefully, "that's a substantial offer. If you're serious, you should put that in writing and clarify the terms." "Fine." Marcus lurched toward his desk and grabbed a piece of his personal letterhead. He scrawled something across it with a pen that kept skipping, his handwriting barely legible. $200 million to anyone who opens my safe. Marcus Blackwood. He signed it with a flourish, dated it, and threw the paper onto his desk. There, witnessed by everyone in this room, now somebody open my goddamn safe. Eleanor picked up the paper and examined it. Then she pulled out her phone and photographed it from multiple angles. "For documentation," she said simply. The specialists returned to their work with renewed intensity, aware that the stakes had suddenly become personal and enormous. Marcus collapsed back into his desk chair and poured another whiskey, his hands trembling so badly that liquid sloshed over the rim of the glass. And in the doorway between the office and the sitting room, so quiet that no one had noticed him, stood Diego Torres. He'd been helping his mother dust the picture frames in the adjacent room when the shouting had started, and he'd moved to where he could see into the office. He'd watched Marcus Blackwood make his offer, had seen the signed paper, had heard the exact words. $200 million to anyone who opens the safe. Diego's mind worked through the implications with a speed and clarity that belied his age. He knew the combination. He'd seen it 6 nights ago, had watched through this very doorway as a drunk Marcus Blackwood had performed for an audience of none, spinning the dial and narrating his actions. Diego's eidetic memory had captured every detail, every number, every rotation. The combination was burned into his brain as permanently as his own name. Left 3 times to 47, right twice to 23, left once to 91, right to 15. He could open that safe right now. In 60 seconds, he was certain of it. But should he? The question paralyzed Diego where he stood. His mother had told him to stay invisible, to not draw attention, to survive this week by going unnoticed. Marcus Blackwood had made his feelings about Diego abundantly clear over the past 6 days, every interaction dripping with contempt and barely disguised racism. Stepping forward now would make Diego visible in the most dramatic way possible. Yet Marcus Blackwood had said anyone. He'd signed a paper saying $200 million to anyone. Diego understood that anyone meant him too, even if the billionaire hadn't intended it that way. $200 million was more money than Diego could really comprehend, but he knew it was enough to change everything. Enough to move his mother out of their small apartment with the dripping faucet. Enough to pay for school, for college, for every opportunity that poverty currently denied him. Enough to mean his mother would never have to clean Marcus Blackwood's floors again, never have to make herself invisible, never have to teach her son to accept being less than. Diego's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. His hands were sweating. Every instinct screamed at him to stay quiet, to remain unnoticed, to not risk the explosion of anger that would surely come from Marcus Blackwood if Diego dared to presume he belonged in this conversation. But then he thought about his mother's tired face, her slumped shoulders, the way she flinched when Marcus Blackwood raised his voice. He thought about 6 days of sitting in a windowless room, of being called names, of learning that some people would always see him as less than human. He thought about Mrs. Patterson telling him he was brilliant, that his mind was a gift, that he could do extraordinary things if given the chance. And he thought about how Marcus Blackwood had said anyone. Diego took a breath, stepped forward into the office doorway, and spoke in a voice that came out smaller than he'd intended, but was still audible in the silent room. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood, can I try?" Every head turned toward him. Elena Voss's eyes widened. Her assistants froze mid-motion, and Marcus Blackwood's face cycled through shock, recognition, and then twisted into something ugly and familiar. The billionaire started laughing, a harsh sound that filled the room like broken glass. "The helps kid wants to try? Are you kidding me? This is what we've come to." He turned to Elena and her team, gesturing at Diego with his whiskey glass. "Did you hear that? 6 days of failure from the best specialists money can buy, and now we're getting offers from 10-year-old kids. What's next? Should we let him count my money too? Give him the passwords to my accounts?" Diego stood frozen in the doorway, his small frame seeming to shrink under Marcus Blackwood's mockery. Behind him, Carmen appeared, her face already crumpling as she realized what had happened. "Diego, come here right now," she said, her voice breaking. But Diego didn't move. He looked up at Marcus Blackwood with those serious eyes that held too much understanding for a child his age, and he said quietly, "You said anyone, sir. You wrote it on that paper. $200 million to anyone who opens your safe." Marcus Blackwood's laughter cut off abruptly. His face flushed darker. "Let me guess, you somehow magically know my combination. You a mind reader now, boy?" Diego shook his head. "I saw you open it. 6 days ago, when you came home late. I was helping my mama clean and I saw you through the door. I remember what you did." The office went very still. Elena Voss leaned forward slightly, her professional interest sparked. Marcus Blackwood stared at Diego with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and rage. "You expect me to believe," Marcus said slowly, "that you watched me once and memorized a complex combination? I have really good memory, sir. My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, says I have eidetic memory. That means I can remember everything I see. I don't forget things. This is ridiculous." Marcus's voice was rising. "You're lying. You're trying to con me. Probably your mother put you up to this. Probably you've been snooping in my office for days, looking for ways to rob me. That's what your kind does, right? Always scheming, always looking for the angle. Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor Voss interjected, "if the child has eidetic memory, it's actually quite plausible that he could have observed and retained the combination. It's a rare condition, but well documented. Don't tell me what's plausible in my own house," Marcus snapped at her. "This is a setup. This is fraud. Probably been planning it for months." He turned his fury on Carmen, who had moved to stand beside her son. "You put him up to this. Years of cleaning my house, and this is how you repay me? Teaching your son to rob me?" Carmen was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Blackwood, I swear, I don't know anything about this." Diego wouldn't lie. If he says he saw something, he saw it. Of course you'd defend him. Probably rehearsed this whole thing. Marcus drained his whiskey glass and slammed it down on his desk. "Well, it's not going to work. I'm not paying $200 million to some kid who probably can't even count that high. This offer was meant for professionals, for actual people, not for—" He caught himself before saying the full slur, but everyone in the room knew what word had been on the tip of his tongue. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken knowledge of exactly what Marcus Blackwood meant when he said, "actual people." "The offer was made without qualifications," Elena said, her voice cold now. "You said anyone. You signed a document saying anyone. That paper doesn't specify professionals, adults, or any particular category. Your words were very clear. If the child can open the safe, the terms of your offer would apply to him." Marcus whirled on her. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm on the side of professional integrity. You made a public offer in front of witnesses. I documented it. If you try to back out, you'll face serious legal consequences, from lawsuits filed by a child." Marcus laughed again. "My lawyers will eat this alive. This is nothing. This is a stupid kid making stupid claims." He turned to Diego, his face twisted with contempt. "You want to try? Fine. Go ahead. When you fail, maybe you'll finally learn your place." Diego looked up at his mother. Carmen's face was anguished, caught between wanting to protect her son and not knowing how. She nodded slowly, helplessly, and Diego took another step into the office. The specialists moved aside, creating a path to the massive safe. Diego walked forward on legs that felt like they might collapse beneath him. The safe loomed before him, 6 feet of brushed steel that suddenly seemed even larger now that he was standing directly in front of it. The dial was positioned at chest height for an adult, which meant it was above Diego's head. He had to stretch up on his tiptoes to reach it. Behind him, Marcus Blackwood watched with a smirk that mixed anticipation of failure with barely suppressed rage. Elena Voss had her phone out, recording. Her assistants had stopped working entirely, all eyes on the small boy reaching up toward a dial that was almost too high for him to grasp. Carmen stood in the doorway with her hands pressed to her mouth, her whole body shaking with fear and hope and helpless love for her son, who was either about to achieve something impossible or suffer another humiliation in a week that had already broken him down day by day. Diego closed his eyes for a moment, reaching into his perfect memory. He saw that night 6 days ago as clearly as if it were happening right now. Saw Marcus Blackwood stumbling to the safe, laughing, drunk, performing for an audience of none, saw his hands on the dial, heard his voice narrating the movements, left 3 complete rotations to 47. That's the year my father died. Right 2 complete rotations to 23. That's my lucky number. Left 1 rotation to 91. That's the year I started my company. Right to 15. The number of millions I made on my first deal. The memory was perfect, crystalline, permanent. Diego opened his eyes and reached for the dial. His small hand barely fit around it, but he gripped it firmly and began to turn. Left. He spun the dial 3 complete times, counting silently, carefully. The metal wheel moved smoothly under his fingers, well-oiled and precisely calibrated. 1 full rotation, 2, 3, stop at 47. The number 47 appeared in the small window beside the dial. Diego paused, gathering himself, then continued. Right. 2 complete rotations now. His tongue peeked out slightly as he concentrated. An unconscious gesture of focus. 1 rotation, 2. Stop at 23. 23 appeared in the window. The room was absolutely silent now. No one moved, no one breathed. Even Marcus Blackwood's smirk had started to fade, replaced by something that might have been nervousness. Left. 1 rotation this time. Diego turned the dial carefully, precisely. Stop at 91. 91 in the window. Diego's heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. His hands were slick with sweat, but the memory was clear, unwavering. One more number. Right. The final movement. Diego turned the dial to 15 and stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, deep inside the safe's mechanism, something clicked. It was a soft sound, barely audible, but in the silent room, it was unmistakable. The lock releasing, the tumblers aligning, the fortress opening. Diego grabbed the heavy handle with both his small hands and pulled. The massive steel door, weighing hundreds of pounds, swung open smoothly on perfectly balanced hinges. Inside, visible to everyone in the room, were stacks of documents, bundles of cash in multiple currencies, leather folders bulging with papers. Marcus Blackwood's treasure, his secrets, all of it exposed by a 10-year-old Latino boy in a cartoon t-shirt who wasn't supposed to matter. Elapsed time, 60 seconds. The silence that followed was total and absolute, as if the world itself had stopped turning. Then chaos erupted in that office high above the manicured grounds, in that mansion built on wealth and arrogance, in that fortress that had just been breached by the person its owner had most dismissed. "Oh my God," one of Elena's assistants whispered. "That's impossible," another breathed. Elena Voss started laughing, a sound of pure amazement and something that might have been vindication. He did it. The child actually did it. In 60 seconds. But the loudest sound in that moment was the crash of Marcus Blackwood's whiskey glass hitting the marble floor and shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces, sharp and dangerous, just like the moment they were all living through. Just like the reckoning that had suddenly, finally, inevitably arrived. The crystal fragments scattered across the white marble, catching the afternoon light and throwing tiny rainbows that seemed absurdly cheerful given the weight of what had just happened. Marcus Blackwood stared at the open safe, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly to track. Shock, disbelief, confusion, and then something darker, something that had been building for 6 days of failure and was now finding a target for all that accumulated rage. "No," he said, his voice strange and flat. "That's impossible. You cheated. You had help." He lunged forward suddenly, his coordination impaired by alcohol and fury, and grabbed Diego roughly by the front of his shirt. The boy's feet left the ground as Marcus lifted him, shaking him hard. "How did you know?" Marcus shouted into Diego's terrified face. "Did your mother tell you? Did you break into my office? Did you install cameras? Tell me right now, you little thief." Diego cried out in pain and fear, his small body ragdoll limp in Marcus's grip. Carmen screamed and rushed forward, trying to pull her son free, but Marcus shoved her with his free hand. Carmen stumbled backward into Elena Voss, who caught her before she could fall. "Mr. Blackwood, stop!" Elena commanded, her voice sharp with authority. "Put the child down immediately." But Marcus was beyond reason, beyond control. All the humiliation of the past 6 days, all the business failures, all the threats to his empire were focusing into this single moment of violence against a child who dared to succeed where experts had failed. "I saw you," Diego sobbed, his head snapping back and forth as Marcus shook him. "That night when you came home late, I was helping Mama clean, and you opened the safe. I just remembered what you did. Liar." Marcus shook him again, harder. "Nobody has that kind of memory, especially not some worthless kid from the projects. You're lying. This is theft. You and your mother have been scheming for months." Elena moved fast. She was across the room in 3 strides, her hand clamping onto Marcus's wrist and twisting with surprising strength. Her voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "Let go of that child right now, or I'm calling the police myself. This is assault. This is battery on a minor. And we're all witnessing it." The threat cut through Marcus's rage enough for his grip to loosen. Diego dropped to his feet and immediately scrambled toward his mother, who gathered him into her arms and sank to the floor, both of them crying, both of them shaking with terror and shock. Elena kept her grip on Marcus's wrist, her phone appearing in her other hand. "I recorded everything," she said quietly. "Your offer, your racial comments, your assault of a 10-year-old child, every word, every action, and I'm not the only one." She gestured to her assistants, who both held up their phones. "Got it all," the younger assistant said. "Video and audio, multiple angles." Marcus stared at the phones, at the evidence being collected in real time, and the full weight of what he'd just done began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged consciousness. He'd assaulted a child, on camera, in front of witnesses, after making a legally binding offer that he'd signed and that the child had fulfilled. His empire hadn't just cracked, it had shattered just like his whiskey glass into 1,000 pieces that could never be put back together. "I'm not paying," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "You think I'm giving $200 million to him? To some welfare kid who probably can't even count that high?" "You made a legally binding offer in front of multiple witnesses," Elena said. "You signed a document. That child fulfilled the terms of your offer. If you refuse to pay, you'll be sued into oblivion. And given what I've just witnessed, given your behavior, I suspect the courts will be very sympathetic to that child. This is fraud," Marcus tried again. "This is a setup." She coached him. His mother told him the combination. "Mr. Blackwood, I have no idea what the combination to your safe is," Carmen said from the floor, where she still held Diego. "I never knew. I never asked. I've been cleaning your house for 9 years, and I've never touched that safe, never looked at it, never cared what was inside it. If my son says he saw something, then he saw it. He doesn't lie. He can't lie. He remembers everything exactly as it happened." "She's defending her criminal son," Marcus said to Elena, appealing to her as if they were on the same side. "Can't you see this is a con? These people are always looking for handouts, always trying to take what isn't theirs. You know how they are." The phrase "you people" hung in the air. Elena's expression hardened. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, I know exactly how they are. They're hard-working people trying to survive in a system that's stacked against them. They're parents protecting their children. They're human beings who deserve basic dignity and respect, which is apparently beyond your capability to provide." She released his wrist and stepped back, her phone still recording. "I'm done here. My team is done. We're leaving. But before we go, let me be very clear. I will testify in any legal proceeding about what happened in this room today. I will provide all video and audio evidence, and I will make damn sure that child gets what he's owed." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Elena was already moving toward the door, her assistants gathering their equipment with practiced efficiency. They filed out of the office, and Carmen stood slowly, still holding Diego, preparing to follow them. "You're fired," Marcus said to Carmen, the words coming out desperate and cruel. "You and your criminal son are done here. Pack your things and get out of my house. Don't expect a reference. Don't expect anything. I'll make sure no one in this city ever hires you again." Carmen met his eyes for the first time in 9 years of employment, and something in her gaze was different now. Not quite defiant, but no longer broken, no longer willing to accept degradation as the price of survival. "We're leaving," she said quietly. "Come on, Diego." They left through the office door, past the shattered glass on the marble floor, past the open safe with its exposed secrets. They walked through the mansion Carmen had cleaned for 9 years, past rooms she'd dusted and floors she'd scrubbed and windows she'd polished until they gleamed. They walked out the service entrance where they'd entered every morning before dawn, climbed into Carmen's 15-year-old sedan, and drove away from the Blackwood estate. Neither of them looked back. Behind them, in his office surrounded by broken glass and broken dreams, Marcus Blackwood stood alone, staring at his open safe and beginning to understand that his nightmare was only beginning. What Marcus didn't know, couldn't have predicted in his alcohol-impaired state, was that Elena Voss had already sent the videos to 3 different people before her car even cleared the estate gates. One copy went to a lawyer friend who specialized in civil rights cases. One went to a journalist who'd been investigating wealth inequality and workplace discrimination, and one went to a colleague who had connections in federal law enforcement. The videos started circulating within hours. By evening, they'd been uploaded to social media platforms by people who'd received them second and third hand. By midnight, they had hundreds of thousands of views. By dawn, the next morning, they'd gone viral. The internet had found its latest symbol of everything wrong with wealth and power and racism, all captured in 12 minutes of clear, undeniable video footage. A billionaire making a public offer, a polite child asking to try, the billionaire's racist mockery, the child's 60-second success, and then the violence, the assault, the hatred laid bare for everyone to see. #PayDiego started trending at 4:23 in the morning. #JusticeForDiego followed an hour later. The video spread across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, every platform where information moved at the speed of outrage. People who'd never heard of Marcus Blackwood learned his name and his face and his cruelty all at once. The footage was devastating in its clarity, impossible to misinterpret or defend. By Monday morning, when Marcus Blackwood woke with another crushing hangover, his phone was exploding with notifications. But these weren't from his assistant or his lawyers or his business partners, though they were calling too. These were alerts from news outlets, social media mentions, emails from reporters requesting comment. His name was trending worldwide. The video had tens of millions of views. Marcus fumbled for his phone with shaking hands and opened Twitter. The first thing he saw was his own face, red with rage, frozen in the moment he was shaking Diego. The image had been screenshotted and turned into a meme, shared and reshared thousands of times. The comments beneath it were uniformly condemning, calling him racist, cruel, criminal. Worse, they were calling for consequences. The story dominated the news cycle. CNN ran segments. MSNBC brought in legal experts to discuss whether Marcus's offer constituted a binding contract. The clips were played and replayed, analyzed from every angle. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding prosecution and enforcement of the contract. Celebrity activists with millions of followers shared the video and called for justice. By noon, Marcus's business partners were scrambling to distance themselves from him. The CEO of a major retail chain that carried products from Marcus's company held a press conference announcing they were severing the relationship. 3 other corporate partners issued similar statements within hours. Marcus's company stock, publicly traded, dropped 40% in value. Protesters began gathering outside his estate by mid-afternoon. 50 people at first, then 100, then 200. They carried signs, "Pay Diego," "Black Excellence Matters," "Children Deserve Dignity." News vans lined the street outside his gates, reporters doing live broadcasts with his mansion visible in the background. More protesters gathered outside Marcus Blackwood's corporate headquarters downtown. Employees arriving for work had to navigate through crowds of people chanting and holding signs. Some of those employees, reading the room and sensing which way the wind was blowing, started quietly reaching out to recruiters and updating their resumes. But the real damage was happening behind the scenes, in places Marcus couldn't see or control. Federal investigators had seen the videos, not just the social media versions, but the full footage that Elena Voss had sent to her law enforcement contact. They'd watched carefully, and some of them had noticed what was visible in the background when the safe door swung open. Documents with offshore bank letterheads, Cayman Islands, Switzerland, British Virgin Islands, bearer bonds in denominations that raised immediate questions, folders marked with notations that looked suspiciously like the kind of labels used in money laundering operations. The footage provided probable cause. By Tuesday afternoon, federal agents had obtained search warrants. By Wednesday morning, they were executing those warrants on every property Marcus Blackwood owned: his mansion, his office, his vacation home. They came with forensic accountants and document specialists and a very long list of questions. What they found exceeded their expectations. Detailed records of tax evasion spanning 15 years. Evidence of money laundering through shell corporations in 6 different countries. Fraud in government contracts worth hundreds of millions. Bribery of foreign officials. The custom safe that Marcus had designed to protect his secrets had protected them beautifully for 6 months. Now those secrets were being catalogued, photographed, and prepared for federal prosecution. Carmen and Diego, meanwhile, were sitting in a small office across town, surrounded by lawyers who'd offered their services pro bono after seeing the video. The ACLU had reached out. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund had called. 3 major civil rights law firms had sent representatives. Everyone wanted to help, wanted to be part of the case that was already being called the biggest workplace discrimination and contract dispute of the decade. Carmen listened to the lawyers explain their options, her hand gripping Diego's tightly. Her son was subdued, still processing everything that had happened, occasionally pressing against her side as if needing the physical reassurance of her presence. The lawyers were talking about breach of contract, wrongful termination, hostile work environment, assault on a minor, emotional distress. The list of potential charges and civil claims kept growing. "Mrs. Torres," one of the lawyers said gently, "you need to understand that this is going to be a long process. Months, maybe over a year. Mr. Blackwood has extensive resources and will fight every step. But you also need to understand that we have extraordinary evidence. Multiple videos, multiple witnesses, his signed offer, and now it appears federal criminal charges are likely. This is as strong a case as I've ever seen." "How much?" Carmen asked quietly. The lawyer had been talking about money, about the $200 million contract, about additional damages, but the numbers were so large, Carmen couldn't quite process them. If we win the breach of contract claim alone, Diego would be entitled to the $200 million that was offered. Then we'd pursue additional damages for the assault, for emotional distress, for the years of discriminatory treatment you experienced as his employee. Other former employees are already coming forward with similar stories. This could become a class action. Carmen closed her eyes. $200 million. It was more money than existed in her concept of the world. It was more money than everyone she knew would earn collectively in their entire lives. It was enough to change everything, to buy safety and education and opportunity and futures that had seemed impossible yesterday. "Other former employees?" she asked, focusing on something she could understand. The lawyer nodded. "Since the video went viral, we've been contacted by 17 other people who worked for Mr. Blackwood over the years. All of them have stories of discrimination, of racist comments, of unfair pay and treatment. We're still vetting their claims, but several appear very strong. We're considering bringing them together in a consolidated lawsuit. So this isn't just about us," Carmen said slowly. "This is about everyone he hurt." "Yes." The lawyer smiled. "What happened to you and Diego has opened a door. Other people are finding the courage to step through it. Your son's 60 seconds of bravery is giving voice to years of silent suffering." Diego looked up at his mother. "Mama, are we in trouble? Did I do something wrong?" Carmen pulled him close, her eyes filling with tears. "No, mijo, you did something brave. You did something right. You opened more than just a safe. You opened the door to justice." The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed, given the overwhelming evidence. Marcus Blackwood's lawyers tried every defense available. They argued the offer was made under duress. The judge reviewed the video of Marcus making the offer, examined his signed document, noted the absence of any coercion, and rejected the argument. They claimed Marcus never intended the offer to apply to a child. The prosecution played clips of him saying anyone repeatedly with no qualifications. They tried to minimize the assault. The video showed Marcus grabbing Diego, shaking him violently, shoving Carmen into a wall. Medical records documented the bruising on Diego's arms. The hate crime enhancement was brutal in its effectiveness. Years of text messages recovered from Marcus's phone, emails to business associates containing racial slurs, recorded conversations from former employees who'd saved evidence of his discrimination, his own words from the viral video, his racist mockery preserved forever. The criminal trial lasted 6 months. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's lawyers tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution, facing immense public pressure and possessing ironclad evidence, refused to offer anything less than significant prison time. The jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every count: tax evasion, money laundering, fraud, bribery, assault on a minor with a hate crime enhancement. The sentencing hearing filled a federal courtroom to capacity. Media packed the gallery. Former employees attended. Civil rights activists were present. And in the front row, dressed in clothes that actually fit him now, instead of the too small jeans and cartoon t-shirt from that day, sat Diego Torres beside his mother. The judge was a woman in her 60s who'd spent her career seeing the worst of human behavior, but still seemed personally affected by this case. She reviewed the evidence aloud, her voice steady but hard. The assault on a child, the decades of discrimination, the systematic fraud, the contempt for law and human dignity. "Mr. Blackwood," she said finally, "you built an empire on exploitation and hatred. You used your wealth as a weapon and a shield. You believed yourself above consequences. This court is here to prove you wrong. 23 years in federal prison for the financial crimes, 5 years concurrent for the assault, asset forfeiture to pay restitution and fines." The civil cases were still pending, but the criminal conviction made them virtually indefensible. Marcus Blackwood was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking somehow shabby now, his face grey and aged. He'd be in his 70s before he was eligible for parole. His empire was gone, sold off piece by piece to pay fines and legal fees. His reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. His name had become synonymous with racism and corruption. Outside the courthouse, Carmen faced a wall of cameras and reporters. Diego stood beside her, her hand on his shoulder. The lawyers had prepared her for this moment, had coached her on what to say, but when the microphones were thrust toward her, Carmen spoke from her heart. "For 9 years I cleaned Mr. Blackwood's floors," she said, her voice quiet but carrying. "For 9 years I made myself invisible because that was the price of feeding my son. I taught Diego to be invisible too, to accept being treated as less than human, because I thought we had no choice. But my son showed me that staying invisible was its own kind of death. Speaking up was terrifying, but it led to justice, not just for us, but for dozens of others who suffered the same way." She paused, her eyes shining with tears. "What destroyed Mr. Blackwood wasn't the safe or my son's memory. It was his own hatred, his inability to see value in my son because of the color of his skin, his refusal to honor his word because he considered us beneath him. My son opened that safe in 60 seconds, but Mr. Blackwood had been opening the door to his own destruction for years. One cruel comment at a time, one racist assumption at a time, one decision to treat people as less than human, one decision at a time. The civil trial happened 8 months later. The breach of contract claim was straightforward, given Marcus's signed offer, the multiple witnesses, and the video evidence. Diego was awarded the full $200 million, reduced somewhat by taxes and legal fees, but still an amount that would ensure he never had to worry about money again. Carmen was awarded $17 million in damages for wrongful termination, hostile work environment, and emotional distress. The class action lawsuit involving 67 other former employees resulted in a collective settlement of $95 million. But perhaps more importantly, the case established legal precedent. Courts explicitly ruled that verbal offers made in front of witnesses were binding contracts regardless of the recipient's age or race, that hate crime enhancements applied to workplace violence, that systemic discrimination could be prosecuted through both criminal and civil channels. Law schools began teaching the Blackwood case as a landmark example of justice finally served. Carmen and Diego moved out of their small apartment into a house with a yard and a fixed faucet, and rooms for both of them. Diego enrolled in a private school with gifted programs and advanced classes that challenged his remarkable mind. Carmen went back to school herself, studying to become a nurse, a dream she'd abandoned years ago when survival took priority over aspiration, and they established the Diego Torres Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping children from disadvantaged backgrounds access educational opportunities. The foundation provided scholarships, tutoring, mentorship, and support for families navigating the barriers that poverty and discrimination created. It employed caseworkers who'd experienced those barriers themselves, who understood what it meant to try to be invisible just to survive. 3 years after the day Diego opened the safe, Carmen sat in the foundation's bright office reviewing scholarship applications. Diego was 13 now, tall for his age, and still remarkably serious, still carrying that quiet intensity that made teachers describe him as an old soul. He divided his time between advanced coursework at his school and volunteering at the foundation, where he tutored younger kids in mathematics and science. The foundation had helped hundreds of families by then. Scholarships had sent kids to college who would never have gone otherwise. Tutoring programs had lifted grades and confidence. Legal aid had protected families from discrimination and exploitation. The work was endless but meaningful, and both Carmen and Diego poured themselves into it. One afternoon, Diego looked up from the tutoring session he was conducting with a 9-year-old girl struggling with long division and asked, "Mama, do you ever regret that day? Do you wish I'd stayed invisible?" Carmen was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question, the fear, the violence, the months of court proceedings and media attention, the way their lives had been turned inside out and examined by millions of strangers, the price they'd paid for justice, but also the justice itself, the vindication, the 67 other families who'd found compensation and closure, the foundation helping hundreds more, the fact that Marcus Blackwood could never hurt anyone else again, the knowledge that staying silent would have been its own kind of death, a slow erosion of dignity and humanity day by day, year by year. "No, mijo," she said finally, "I wouldn't have stopped you. Because staying silent was killing us slowly anyway. Every day of pretending his treatment was acceptable, of teaching you to be invisible, of accepting less than we deserved. That was its own kind of destruction. Speaking up was terrifying, but it led to justice. Not just for us, but for dozens of others who suffered the same way." Diego nodded thoughtfully, returning his attention to his student. "What destroyed Mr. Blackwood wasn't really the safe or my memory, was it?" "No, baby." Carmen smiled sadly. "It was his own hatred. His inability to see value in you because of the color of your skin. His refusal to honor his word because he considered you beneath him. That safe was designed to protect him from the world, but he never protected himself from what was in his own heart." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the young girl between them working through her division problem with Diego's patient guidance. Outside the foundation office windows, the city spread out in afternoon light, full of families struggling just like Carmen and Diego had struggled, full of children brilliant and gifted and dismissed because of their circumstances. The work would never be finished. The fight against discrimination would go on. But change was possible. Justice could prevail. Carmen thought about all the other children out there right now, being told they didn't belong, that they should aim lower, that their kind would never amount to anything. How many other Diegos were being told to be invisible, to accept mistreatment, to survive by disappearing? How many other Carmens were teaching their children that staying quiet was the only option? The story of Marcus Blackwood and Diego Torres would be told for years to come, in classrooms and courtrooms, in ethics courses and diversity training, a reminder that power without compassion was tyranny, that wealth without humanity was worthless, that sometimes the people dismissed and underestimated possessed exactly what the powerful needed, and that sometimes justice arrived in 60 seconds. You just had to be brave enough to reach for it. The foundation grew over the years, expanding its programs and reach. By the time Diego was 16, it was operating in 12 cities, helping thousands of families annually. By the time he was 18 and preparing for college, the foundation had become one of the most respected civil rights organizations in the country. Diego chose to study mathematics and computer science at Stanford, accepting a full scholarship that he certainly didn't need financially, but that felt symbolically important. His professors quickly recognized his extraordinary abilities, his eidetic memory giving him advantages in coursework that required extensive memorization and pattern recognition. But Diego was careful never to let his gifts make him arrogant, never to forget where he came from or how easily his life could have been different. He returned home during breaks to work at the foundation, and during one of those visits, a reporter asked him about the day he opened the safe. It had been 5 years by then, but people still wanted to hear about it, still found the story compelling and meaningful. "What I remember most," Diego said thoughtfully, "isn't opening the safe. It's the moment before, when I had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. Every instinct told me to stay invisible, like my mother had taught me, but something else told me that invisible wasn't enough anymore. That sometimes you have to be seen, even when being seen is scary, even when the people in power don't want to acknowledge you exist." The reporter asked if he'd known he could open the safe, if he'd been certain of the combination. Diego smiled. "I was certain. My memory doesn't work like other people's. When I see something, it's recorded perfectly and permanently. The combination was burned into my mind. But being certain I could open it and being certain I should try were different things. The combination was just numbers. The decision to speak up, that was courage." "What would you say to other kids in similar situations?" the reporter asked. "Kids facing discrimination or being told they don't matter?" Diego thought carefully before answering. "I'd say that your worth isn't determined by people who refuse to see it. That intelligence and ability and humanity exist independent of recognition. But I'd also say that sometimes you have to demand to be seen. Sometimes staying silent and invisible isn't survival, it's slow destruction. And when the moment comes to speak up, to step forward, to prove what you're capable of, take it. It's terrifying, it might go wrong, but staying invisible guarantees nothing changes." The reporter asked one final question. "Do you think what happened to you was worth it? The assault, the trauma, the months of legal proceedings?" Diego glanced at his mother, who was watching from across the foundation office. She smiled at him with pride and love that made his chest ache in the best possible way. "Worth it," Diego said slowly. "I think that's the wrong question. It shouldn't have been necessary. I shouldn't have had to prove my worth or my humanity. My mother shouldn't have spent 9 years being degraded. Mr. Blackwood shouldn't have been able to operate with impunity for decades. But given that those things were true, given that the situation existed, yes, speaking up was worth it. Not because it was easy or pleasant, but because silence would have been worse. Carmen watched her son field questions with a maturity and eloquence that made her heart swell. He'd grown so much from that scared 10-year-old reaching up toward a dial that was almost too high to grasp, but he hadn't lost his essential self, that core of quiet intensity and fundamental decency that made him who he was. After the reporter left, Diego came to sit beside his mother at her desk. They sat in comfortable silence, watching through the windows as parents brought their children to the Foundation's after-school tutoring program. Kids of every ethnicity and background, all of them getting the support and recognition that the educational system failed to provide. "Mama," Diego said quietly, "do you think things have really changed? Or did we just win one case while everything else stays the same?" Carmen considered the question seriously. "Both, I think. We won one case that mattered enormously to us and to the 67 other families in the class action. We created this foundation that's helping thousands more. We set legal precedents that make it easier for others to seek justice. Those are real changes. But discrimination still exists. Children are still told they don't matter because of their race or class. Parents still have to choose between dignity and survival. The system that allowed Marcus Blackwood to operate for so long, that's still largely intact." She paused, looking at the children streaming through the Foundation doors. "But every case like ours chips away at that system. Every time someone speaks up instead of staying silent, the Foundation cracks a little more. Change is slow and it's hard and it's never as complete as we want. But it's possible. We're proof of that." Diego nodded slowly. "I want to do more. The Foundation is amazing, but I want to work on systemic change. Maybe policy work, maybe law, something that addresses the root causes instead of just treating symptoms." Carmen smiled and put her arm around his shoulders. "You'll do whatever you set your mind to, mijo. You always have." Years passed. Diego graduated from Stanford with highest honors and went on to Harvard Law School, where he focused on civil rights law and constitutional protections for marginalized communities. Carmen completed her nursing degree and split her time between clinical work at a community health center and running the foundation. Both of them remained grounded despite their wealth, keenly aware that they'd been both lucky and unlucky, blessed with Diego's gifts, but cursed with circumstances that made those gifts necessary for survival. The foundation continued expanding, developing new programs and partnerships. They launched a scholarship fund specifically for children of domestic workers, ensuring that other kids whose parents cleaned wealthy people's homes had paths to education and opportunity. They created a legal defense fund for workers facing discrimination. They established mentorship programs, pairing successful professionals from underrepresented backgrounds with students navigating similar paths. And they tracked every case of workplace discrimination that went to trial, studying outcomes and patterns, building a database of evidence about systemic inequality. Diego used that research in his law school studies, developing frameworks for more effective civil rights litigation. The work was never finished, but the work mattered. Marcus Blackwood, meanwhile, languished in federal prison. His appeals had been rejected at every level. His former business partners had distanced themselves completely. His family had largely abandoned him. He spent his days in a cell that measured a tiny fraction of his former office, surrounded by men who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. His name had become synonymous with racist arrogance, a cautionary tale told to warn others about the consequences of believing oneself above the law. He had years left on his sentence, and there was no early release for federal hate crimes. He would be an old man before he saw freedom again if he lived that long. His health was deteriorating from lack of exercise, poor prison food, and the chronic stress of being a wealthy white-collar criminal among men who had no sympathy for his situation. But beyond Marcus himself, the ripple effects of his downfall continued spreading. His case had sparked a national conversation about wealth inequality, racism in corporate America, and the vulnerability of domestic workers. Laws were passed in several states enhancing protections for household employees. Companies revised their policies on discrimination. Business schools taught case studies about ethical leadership, using Marcus as an example of everything not to do. The safe that had started it all, that Resistance Class 7 marvel of engineering that Marcus had commissioned at such great expense, was eventually sold at auction. The proceeds went to the victims of Marcus's fraud. The safe ended up in a museum of American business history, displayed alongside the story of what it had protected and what its opening had revealed. People came to see it, this massive steel monument to one man's paranoia, and the child who'd breached it in 60 seconds. When Diego was 25, he argued his first case before a federal appeals court. It involved a black sanitation worker who'd been passed over for promotion 30 times in favor of less qualified white candidates. The discrimination was obvious but difficult to prove through documentation alone. Diego built a case using pattern analysis, statistical evidence, and witness testimony that demonstrated systemic bias. He won. The sanitation worker received his promotion, back pay, and damages. 7 other workers in similar situations joined a follow-up lawsuit. After the verdict, reporters asked Diego how it felt to win his first major case. He thought about his answer carefully, aware that his words would be recorded and shared. "It feels like the beginning," he said. "One case won, thousands more waiting. But every victory matters. Every time we force a system to acknowledge its own discrimination, we make it slightly harder for that discrimination to continue unchallenged." My mother taught me that survival sometimes requires invisibility, but I've learned that change requires visibility, demanding to be seen, refusing to accept that some people matter less than others. A reporter asked if he thought his own case, the famous safe incident, had given him advantages in his legal career. Diego smiled at the question. Of course it did. Name recognition, resources, platform. I'd be naive to pretend otherwise, but advantages create responsibilities. I was given something extraordinary, both my memory and the circumstances that made that memory valuable. I have an obligation to use those advantages for others who face discrimination but don't have my resources or visibility. "What about Marcus Blackwood?" another reporter asked. "Do you ever think about him?" Diego's expression grew more serious. "I think about what he represented, not him personally, but what his behavior revealed about structures of power and prejudice. He wasn't unique. There are countless Marcus Blackwoods out there, believing their wealth and status place them above consequences, treating people as less than human based on race or class. He just got caught. He had the bad luck to target someone with a photographic memory who witnessed his vulnerability. But the system that enabled him for decades, that's what really needs to change. The foundation that Carmen and Diego built continued growing over the next decade. By the time Diego was 35, it was operating in every state, helping tens of thousands of families annually. The original focus on educational access had expanded to include legal aid, housing assistance, healthcare navigation, job placement, and financial literacy. The staff grew to hundreds of people, most of them drawn from the communities they served, people who understood poverty and discrimination from personal experience. Carmen was 50 by then, her hair beginning to grey, but her energy undimmed. She still worked at the community health center several days a week, still remembered what it felt like to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, still refused to forget where she'd come from. She'd been approached numerous times to run for political office, her story and her work making her an attractive candidate. She'd declined every time, preferring the direct impact of the foundation to the compromises of politics. But she did speak publicly, frequently, and effectively. She testified before Congress about protections for domestic workers. She gave keynotes at conferences on economic justice. She was interviewed by major media outlets about her experiences, and she was always careful to center the broader issues rather than just her personal story. What happened to my son and me wasn't unique, she told a packed auditorium at a civil rights conference. We were just lucky that it was captured on video, that it went viral, that it penetrated the public consciousness in a way that forced accountability. But thousands of domestic workers face discrimination and abuse every single day. Most of them never see justice. Most of them have to choose between speaking up and feeding their families. The system relies on that silence. Breaking that silence, creating structures that protect vulnerable workers, that's the real work we need to focus on. She paused, looking out at an audience that included policymakers, activists, workers, and survivors of discrimination. My son opened a safe in 60 seconds, but we've been working for 15 years to open the harder safe, the one that protects systems of inequality and exploitation. That safe doesn't have a combination you can memorize. You have to dismantle it piece by piece, law by law, case by case, person by person. It's slow work, it's frustrating work, but it's necessary work. The applause was sustained and heartfelt. After her speech, dozens of people approached her with their own stories, their own experiences of discrimination and survival. Carmen listened to each one, taking notes, making connections, thinking about how the foundation might help. This was what she did best now, connecting people and resources, finding ways to turn individual suffering into collective action. Diego, meanwhile, had become one of the most successful civil rights attorneys in the country. His cases consistently broke new ground, establishing precedents that expanded protections for marginalized communities. His eidetic memory gave him extraordinary advantages in court, able to recall every detail of documents, depositions, and testimony without notes. But his success came from more than just his remarkable memory. It came from genuine understanding of what discrimination felt like, what it cost, how it shaped lives and destroyed potential. He won more cases than he lost, but the losses still haunted him. Every case where justice wasn't served, every client whose life couldn't be made whole despite victory in court, every system that resisted change despite overwhelming evidence of its failures. The work was never finished. The safe was never fully opened. But there were victories worth celebrating. The class action lawsuit against a national restaurant chain that had systematically paid immigrant workers less than minimum wage. 3,000 workers received back pay and damages, and the company was forced to overhaul its employment practices. The case against a hospital system that provided inferior care to patients of color. Millions in damages and a complete reorganization of treatment protocols. The case against a school district that funneled students of color into remedial classes, regardless of ability. Hundreds of children moved into appropriate advanced coursework, and the tracking system was dismantled. Each case was a piece of that larger safe, that system of discrimination and inequality. Each victory was another section dismantled, another lock opened. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless. On the 20th anniversary of the day Diego opened Marcus Blackwood's safe, the foundation held a major fundraising gala. The event drew hundreds of attendees, including many of the families the foundation had helped over 2 decades. There were scholarship recipients who'd graduated from college and gone on to successful careers, former clients of the legal aid program, workers who'd found dignified employment through job placement services. The ballroom was full of people whose lives had changed because a 10-year-old boy had refused to stay invisible. Diego gave the keynote address that evening, standing at a podium in a rented tuxedo that still felt slightly uncomfortable compared to his usual courtroom attire. He looked out at the assembled crowd and felt the weight of 2 decades, all the work and hope and frustration and small victories that had brought them to this moment. 20 years ago today, he began, I was a 10-year-old kid in a cartoon t-shirt, watching safe specialists fail to crack a code. I was supposed to be invisible. My mother had taught me that survival meant not being noticed, not drawing attention, accepting my place in a world that had decided my place was at the bottom. But something happened that day. A billionaire made an offer without thinking about who might claim it, and I had to decide whether to stay safe in my invisibility or risk being seen. He paused, looking at his mother in the front row. She was crying quietly, proud tears that she didn't bother to hide. I chose to be seen, and it was terrifying, and it hurt. My mother lost her job. We were harassed. We had to relive trauma over and over in court proceedings. The price of visibility was high, but the price of continued invisibility would have been higher. It would have been my soul, my humanity, my mother's dignity, the continued suffering of dozens of other workers who found courage to come forward after seeing our case. He gestured to the crowd. Every person in this room represents a moment of choosing visibility over invisibility, choosing to demand dignity instead of accepting degradation, choosing to speak up instead of staying silent. That's what this foundation really does. We don't just provide scholarships or legal aid or job placement. We tell people that they deserve to be seen, that their humanity matters, that systems of discrimination can be challenged and sometimes defeated. The speech continued for 15 more minutes, but those were the words that resonated, that got quoted in the coverage of the event. Choosing visibility over invisibility, demanding to be seen, refusing to accept that some lives matter less than others. The gala raised $12 million that night, funding that would allow the foundation to expand into 3 more states and launch 2 new programs. But more than the money, the event represented something about endurance and hope. 20 years of work, thousands of families helped, hundreds of cases won, systems slowly, incrementally changing. After the gala, after the last guests had left and the ballroom had been cleaned, Carmen and Diego sat together in a quiet corner, both exhausted but content. Outside the windows, the city glittered in the darkness, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one carrying its own struggles and dreams. "Mijo," Carmen said softly, "are you happy? With your life? With your work? Do you ever wish things had been different?" Diego thought about the question. His photographic memory let him recall every detail of his childhood, including the pain and fear and humiliation. But it also let him remember every person they'd helped, every case they'd won, every incremental improvement in systems that had seemed immovable. "I'm happy, Mama. Not because everything worked out perfectly, because it didn't. Not because there's no more work to do, because there's always more work. But because we chose to be visible when it would have been safer to hide. Because we used what happened to us to help others. Because that scared 10-year-old kid reached up toward a dial that was too high and opened something bigger than a safe." He paused, looking at his mother with love and gratitude. "You taught me to be invisible to survive. Then you let me become visible to really live. That's the greatest gift you could have given me." Carmen squeezed his hand, tears running down her face again. "You gave me a gift too, Mijo. You showed me that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. About refusing to let fear be the thing that defines you." They sat together in that quiet corner as the night deepened outside, 2 people who'd survived by learning to be invisible and then changed their lives by demanding to be seen. The work would continue tomorrow. Cases would need to be prepared. Programs would need to be managed. People would need help. But for this moment they could rest in the knowledge that they'd chosen correctly, that the price of visibility had been worth paying. The story of Marcus Blackwood and Diego Torres became one of those rare moments where a single incident illuminated broader truths and sparked genuine change. Law schools taught it. Business ethics courses analyzed it. Civil rights organizations cited it. It became shorthand for conversations about racism, inequality, courage, and accountability. But perhaps the most important legacy was quieter and more personal. Every child who saw Diego's story and learned that their gifts mattered regardless of others' prejudice. Every parent who found courage to speak up against discrimination at work. Every person who refused to accept invisibility as the price of survival. Every small act of resistance against systems that demanded conformity and silence. Those ripples spread outward, impossible to fully track or quantify. A teacher who pushed for gifted programs in an underfunded school because she remembered Diego's story. A lawyer who took on a civil rights case they might have declined. A business owner who implemented fair pay practices for domestic workers. A child who refused to hide their intelligence because they'd learned that brilliance doesn't require permission from those who refuse to see it. Change happened slowly, person by person, decision by decision, but it happened. The safe was opening, not in 60 seconds, but over decades, as individuals and communities chose visibility over invisibility, dignity over degradation, justice over silent suffering. Marcus Blackwood died in federal prison 7 years after his conviction, at age 62. His death received minimal media coverage, a brief mention in the business section of a few newspapers. The man who'd once commanded headlines and wielded power over hundreds of employees passed largely unnoticed and unmourned. His estate, what little remained after fines and restitution, was divided among his creditors and ex-wives. His name lived on primarily as a cautionary tale, a symbol of how hatred and arrogance destroy those who embrace them. Diego was 37 when he learned of Marcus's death. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a kind of sad acknowledgement that a human life had been wasted on cruelty and pride. He donated money in Marcus's name to the foundation, not out of respect, but because redirecting even Marcus's memory toward good work seemed like a kind of redemption for all the damage the man had done. Carmen's reaction was similar. She'd long ago stopped hating Marcus Blackwood personally, though she hated what he represented and the systems that had enabled him. His death was just a fact, neither good nor bad, simply the end of a life that had caused immense harm and ultimately faced consequences. But both of them thought about the other victims of discrimination who never saw justice, who never had their 60 seconds of vindication. The domestic workers still afraid to speak up. The children still being told they don't belong. The parents still teaching their kids to be invisible because the alternative seems too dangerous. For every Marcus Blackwood held accountable, dozens more operated with impunity. That knowledge fueled their continued work. The foundation kept growing. Diego kept litigating. Carmen kept speaking and organizing and connecting people to resources. The work was never finished because the systems that created people like Marcus Blackwood were deeply embedded in the culture, constantly regenerating in new forms. But there was hope in the work itself, in the people who refused to accept degradation, in the incremental changes that accumulated over time. The safe was opening, slowly but steadily, revealing not treasure, but truth. Truth about how inequality operated, how prejudice destroyed potential, how courage could challenge systems that seemed immovable. And at the center of it all was a memory from 20 years ago. A small boy reaching up toward a dial that was almost too high to grasp. 60 seconds of precise movements, number by number, rotation by rotation, the satisfying click of tumblers aligning, the heavy door swinging open, the gasp of witnesses who'd seen the impossible become real. That moment lived on, perfect and permanent in Diego's eidetic memory and in the collective memory of everyone who'd seen the video or heard the story. It was a reminder that sometimes the people dismissed as worthless possess exactly what the powerful need. That intelligence and ability exist independent of recognition or permission, that 60 seconds of courage can cascade into decades of change. The safe was open, the work continued. Justice, slow and imperfect but real, moved forward one case at a time, one life at a time, one moment of choosing visibility over invisibility at a time. And somewhere, in a small apartment or a windowless break room or a classroom where resources were scarce but dreams were abundant, another child was learning their gifts mattered. Another parent was finding courage to speak up. Another person was refusing to accept that their humanity required permission from those who wielded power. The ripples spread outward, unstoppable as water, gentle as hope, powerful as truth. The story wasn't over. It would never be over. But it was being written, day by everyone who chose to be seen instead of staying invisible. Everyone who reached towards something just beyond their grasp and discovered they were taller than they'd been told. Everyone who opened their own safe in their own 60 seconds and found inside not treasure, but their own reflected worth, clear and undeniable and permanent. That was the real legacy. Not the money or the verdicts or the headlines, but the countless individual moments of courage happening in silence and obscurity, each one cracking the larger systems of oppression just a little bit more, until someday, somehow, those systems would finally shatter completely under the accumulated weight of people refusing to accept their own invisibility. The safe was open, the work continued, and hope, fragile but resilient, endured.